Welcome to the Hope After Narcissistic Abuse podcast. I am your host, Amy Helms. Each week, you will hear from experts across the country and even world speak to you on recovering from narcissistic abuse and even how to manage these relationships. You will also hear some periodic solo episodes on how to manage these relationships and what recovery is like. It is my hope that you will leave each episode with some renewed hope that you can and will beat this. Thank you for tuning in. Welcome to Bracing the Narcissist, and I'm so excited on this episode to be interviewing Courtney Fields. Courtney is an expert in divorce and custody matters. And after learning about Courtney, all I could think was just, wow, I would have loved to have her on my team during my own divorce. Courtney is a licensed social worker with more than 20 years of experience in navigating intersection of family and mental health. And I would love for just kind of Courtney to take over and, tell us about, how you got here and what you do.
Yes, thank you so much, Amy. I'm so happy to be here and help your audience with some of the things that I know. So I am a licensed clinical social worker, and I've been practicing in the field mostly with children and families for about 20 plus years. The last 10 years have been while I was in private practice, doing counseling and doing play therapy and working with families. And I'm the child of many divorces. And so I never set out to make divorce my specialty. I actually wanted to run as far away from it as possible. But I just found out that I've got kind of like a set of skills that most clinicians like myself, they don't have. So I'm a certified forensic interviewer, and I'm also a mental health professional, and I was a paralegal at one point. And so this kind of trifecta made me a really good fit for the world of divorce and child custody. And I started seeing kids whose parents were involved in litigation and custody battles, and I was their therapist, and was very effective at being able to help both the parents who hated each other. I was able to get them to trust me. They would both trust me. They're like, well, we'll just let Courtney, we'll ask Courtney what to do. And so I don't know if it was like I was kissed by a fairy or some kind of magic trick that I didn't know I had, but I developed a reputation for being able to just kind of stay out of the fray, but get both parents to come to some sense of reason. And that just made me effective. And so I turned it into a whole organization. Now we have 3 locations and a team of folks all under one roof to support you in this process.
I'm sure being a child of divorce and knowing what it's like to be bounced back and forth and having people go through you instead of adults kind of gave you insight as well into what I didn't want. So let's make it better for your kids.
Absolutely. And kids of divorce, they really do need to be parented a little different. There are certain things that I tell folks, one way to conceptualize it is that your children's definition of family is not the same as yours anymore. So that very definition, that very core sense of who is my family changes for the parents and for the children when divorce happens. So you do have to kind of see things from their perspective. So there's some nuances that I help parents see as well.
So what were some of those nuances?
Well, one of the kind of a funny thing is children of divorce have something called question fatigue. They just, if you did a study on the number of questions that the average number of questions a child gets asked in life, children of divorce, especially with parents that don't communicate, they get asked way more. They get, what did you do at dad's house this weekend? Well, if you and dad talked, you would know, and you wouldn't have to ask me that question. So it seems like a pretty benign thing. It's not a harmful question, but they just get more. And so sometimes they just shut down on general questions. So they'll be the kids that are like, fine, I don't know. Or I don't want to answer any questions right now, even if it's about just normal things that they normally would. It's just question fatigue in general. That's one of them.
That reminds me, my son would be on FaceTime when he would talk to his dad, and his dad would say, well, what are you eating for dinner? And he'd be taking a bite of like pork chop, and he would say chicken nuggets because he was just so tired of it that he just started answering random things just to get the questions to end.
That's a great example. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So How about the divorce drama triangle I've seen about?
Yes. So the trauma triangle is really the cement that got poured first on the foundation of everything that I've built. And it comes from, it's not a new idea. It was first termed by Stephen Cartman, a psychologist back in the late 70s, early 80s. And it was used to describe specifically people diagnosed with personality disorders. And there's many types of personality disorders. I know narcissist is definitely part of our common language now, but there's many others. There's borderline, there's obsessive compulsive, histrionic, there's all kinds. But one thing that he found that they all have in common is the same world view. And basically, the triangle represents 3 different worldviews. And that is victim, rescuer, and persecutor. And these are also roles that are played in their world. And so it really ultimately is a defense mechanism to help them cope with difficult feelings, because difficult feelings are intolerable. So if you think that you can categorize everything in the whole world, everybody, everything, every system into just 3 categories, you can make yourself feel pretty secure in your view, and you can think you're right all the time. So it's basically a maladaptive coping skill, but it's just a shared dynamic amongst personality disorders in general from when we first started learning about them and diagnosing them. And then it can also come to play. And what I've noticed is that the child custody and divorce world is quite the perfect stage for this same dynamic to play out, whether it's personality disorder related or situationally related. And you can also see it in addiction. You can see it in other mental health issues. And then, of course, you see it in personality disorders, and you see it a lot in high conflict divorce cases, because even though about 10% of all divorce cases are high conflict, within that 10%, it's suspected that something like 80% involve one party that likely has a diagnosable personality disorder. And so you just see this concept very consistently in this world.
Interesting. So what would that triangle look like with someone with narcissism?
Well, it would look like that. So the triangle concept represents the relationship pattern. And if you imagine the triangle always in motion, so these relationships are never static. The reason why they're not stable is because the nature of drama is chaos. The nature of chaos is movement. I mean, we could go down what substances look like under a microscope, but I don't remember anything past the 4th grade when it comes to science. So we'll just leave that there.
Yes.
That chaos is motion, and there's no pattern to it. So typically, you enter this relationship first as a rescuer. So if you are just a generally kind, warm-hearted, nurturing personality, you are susceptible to encountering a person like this and feeling like it was meant to be, because they're going to trigger all your needs, because they're going to portray themselves as the victim. So you really do see a very intense initial coming together in this dynamic. Another way to put it is you also see it's very similar to the patterns of someone with codependency and just someone who's emotionally manipulative by nature. It's the yin to the yang. So they feel a very powerful connection at first because nobody's showing their red flags. All the red flags are hidden, except usually the intensity is a red flag and the speed at which the relationship develops is a red flag. But once you are inside those roles, so if you think about the points of the triangle as the entry point into the drama, because of the nature of drama, you cannot stay in the role that you entered. And the reason why you cannot stay is because there is no logic that dictates the change of the role, because the role is based on perception only. So that when I say it's that world, the worldview, that person perceives everybody and everything as either the victim, a persecutor, or rescuer. And what they perceive, they're going to play out as kind of one of the other roles.
Right.
So the best way to determine, one of the best first questions to ask yourself, like, am I in a drama triangle, is, am I in a relationship where there's this pattern where they get mad at me and I don't know why? Like, I can't figure out what I did wrong, but they're suddenly mad at me again, and I can't keep track of why they're mad at me. It's because logic doesn't dictate why they're mad at you. Their perception and the unpredictability of drama and chaos dictates why they're mad at you.
Such a great explanation. So, we think of sometimes when people start become more sure of themselves and more assertive, we see more chaos in the relationship. Is that because there's a role change in that triangle?
Yes. I mean, the role change is the nature. So when you describe more success, then maybe they feel like they're now a rescuer. Oh, look, I can help you. Or maybe that they have power and control over you, but they see it as rescuing. You may feel it as a victim, and it may actually be victimization. That's where some of the psychological abuse can play out, is that they're perceiving themselves as rescuing you when they're actually abusing you. So the perception and the reality are totally different things. And that's where that just confusion and brain fog can come, and why it's hard for lots of people on the outside of your world to understand what's happening, because they're just seeing like, oh, he seems great. Like, he's always talking about how he wants to help you and stuff. Why are you saying he's doing these bad things? Because they really do believe they're rescuing, more than likely. But how they do it is abusive.
Right. As you said, logic doesn't apply in these cases. It doesn't make sense.
And that's the first hurdle to get over when you're trying to understand this, because we are all very logic minded. Our brain's job from the day we were born is to try to make sense of our world. And our brains will get stuck on this one because it does not pass the common sense test, and it never will. So there's a letting go that has to happen, that it's not ever going to make sense. The only thing that's going to make sense is that it'll never be logical.
So when someone realizes they're in this triangle, and what advice would you have to give them on, getting out, getting help?
Mm-hmm. Well, my first disclaimer before I give that advice is always, safety first. So you can see this dynamic play out in situations where it's emotionally unsafe, and you can see it play out where it's both emotionally unsafe and physically unsafe. If you are physically unsafe, then don't do anything except get yourself safe. That's my disclaimer. So that's always the priority. This technique that I'm going to teach your listeners is not effective if your life is in danger. Okay.
Right. And we know that most dangerous time, especially for people who are being abused, to leave is like right at the end. So it's especially important to know safety.
Yes. Safety first. Access to, there's lots. National Domestic Violence Hotline is a good first resource. So let's say that you're physically safe, but you can't go anywhere, but you do need to figure out how to navigate this relationship. Or let's say that you got out, but you've got to navigate a co-parenting relationship without it, imploding like it always has. So the technique that I teach in a nutshell, and I go way more in depth than this in my podcast, is a concept called compassionate neutrality. And basically what you're doing is you're learning to communicate with that person in a very intentional way that is going to feel uncomfortable at first because it's not your nature, but it's you showing your true nature puts you at risk of emotional harm. So you need a boundary there anyway, regardless if that person's your parent, your spouse, whomever. So you put up boundaries with that person on how much access they have to who you are and what you think and feel. And so the compassionate, neutral way of communicating is a boundary in and of itself. The main task here is that you want to confuse the person so that they can't neatly put you into any of the three categories. And so you've got to look at what you're doing or saying that might give them ammunition to perceive you as a victim or rescuer or persecutor. So it's kind of the opposite of walking on eggshells in the sense that you're real intentional. I mean, it's still kind of eggshell-like, but you're really focused on how are they perceiving me when I do this? And I want to make sure that I don't give them any fodder for seeing me as a victim, rescuer, or persecutor. So, for example, if you just ignore someone like this and you just say nothing, it's been called by some circles as a gray rock. Gray rock doesn't work consistently because it doesn't feel good for someone to ignore you. And if you don't feel good, then you've got evidence or you've got ammunition to see that person as a persecutor. You ignored me. That's not nice.
Right. You're keeping me from the kids. You're not letting me do this. So.
You didn't answer my question, all of that. So it gives them, is fuel to the fire, basically. And you want to remove the fuel. But if you say something in a compassionate, neutral way, let's say that you don't want to respond to a loaded, manipulative text that you get from that person, then you can say something compassionate, but the trick with the compassion is got to be real low level. Like it can't be, because you can't be perceived as a rescuer either. So it's got to be generic compassion. Like you're a fellow human being on this planet level compassion, not you're my child's father, you're my partner, you're my parent, not that level of compassion, low level, generic. So I teach folks to like always preface their sentence with something like that universally applies to everybody. Divorce is hard. Co-parenting is tough work. However, and then you get to the second part of your sentence and you just say something neutral. However, I will answer your question tomorrow instead of today.
That's a great one. So I'll throw out a few that I've heard.
Okay.
It's noted that you did not return the Navy pants.
Mm-hmm. Man, keeping up with kids' clothes is tough stuff. However, I'm not aware of these Navy pants that you're referring to.
That's a great neutral response. And I know the initial temptation is to give this long response. I would never do that. And they must be your house. You're not looking for it. So it's a great way to stay out of that conflict.
Yes. And that you have to get out of your own defense. You have to be aware of your own defense mechanisms with that person, because that would be something like justifying your response, feeling like you have to justify. They don't think of that as access to your thoughts and feelings. They should not get access to those. No access to thoughts and feelings, because they will turn that and use it for harm on you. So that's where you can kind of pull back from the need to do that. Just remember, they don't get access to my thoughts and feelings.
Okay, great. So you're kind of talking when like the process is going on. How would you apply this if you're actually co-parenting with someone and dealing with that conflict?
This applies no matter what stage you're in. It really is more just about how do I make sure that in whatever way I'm communicating to them, I don't give them a free pass to see me as any of these roles. So really it's about a prevention of perception by that other person in general. So you can use it universally. With active co-parenting, or even let's just say active litigation. Because you can do this during active litigation, because a lot of times I know like I'm in active litigation and I'm actively co-parenting. I got to do both at the same time. I can't just stop one. So there may be something that comes up that's a hot button, or a jab. Maybe you get a jab in there about, well, we wouldn't be here if you hadn't have taken me to court. I get, and I'll just freely admit this, well, I never wanted this in the first place. And I'm just like, oh, here we go. So when I hear something like that, I may say, nobody wants their family to break apart. Mm-hmm. However, these are the things that I can talk to you about today. The rest will be in court. Or you can also say, I'm deciding to follow my attorney's advice. You can say things like that to keep from, that can also be the way that you give a non-answer. Well, why aren't you letting me have extra time? I understand all parents want as much time as possible with their children. However, I'm deciding to follow my attorney's advice right now.
Yeah, no, that's a great one right there, because I know that's one that a lot of people deal with in the co-parenting, is trying to negotiate that plan. And it really is best just to listen to your attorney when it comes down to it.
As long as your attorney's giving good advice.
Yeah, true.
Also, may need to be a temporary boundary that you follow the parenting plan more strictly, because if you don't, then you could be perceived as a rescuer just by giving them an extra 3 hours. I mean, it really can be as simple as that you suddenly get perceived as the rescuer. So there's a lot of times where you might be okay with the negotiation, but you may want to choose not to, just for the sake of not being perceived as the rescuer, and the attempt to pull you in to the drama is strengthened.
Mm-hmm. No, I love that one. Now, you do co-parenting yourself. You work with with couples. What advice do you have for people that are just entering that phase or possibly going to be in co-parenting counseling? How to approach it?
Well, first of all, co-parenting counseling or parent coordination is not the place or the time to get closure on the past. So there is a level of compartmentalization that you need to do. You need to have your own therapist if you need to get that closure. You want to make sure that you're staying in the present and moving forward to make it the most effective. That's difficult, especially if you're feeling triggered, especially if you have a trauma response to that person. But an effective co-parent counselor and an effective parent coordinator, they're using a combination of two different skills. They're using, psychological support and interventions and kind of mediation. They're a hybrid role. So there's limits to how much they can support you with your emotions about the process. So like in my organization right now, I'll just tell you a good example. I have co-parenting that I'm doing. One of the parents has an individual counselor in my organization. One of the children has a therapist in my organization, and I'm doing the co-parenting. And the parents have given us permission to collaborate. And so it almost is like fast forward the progress is what I found. Mm-hmm. And it really just minimizes that window of opportunity for manipulation of the professionals to occur as well.
Right. That's great advice. And a lot of times the order for co-parenting is put into place, but people don't know what it is. And you show up that first day and it can be a rehashing of old stuff, or you treat it like your therapist. And so that's great advice.
Well, and I will say too, to your listeners, and this is why I also do training of other professionals, is that you can get someone say that they do co-parenting and they don't do it well. I mean, it is something that there's not a certification in most states. There's best practices, but nobody's holding them to the fire to follow those best practices. So you definitely want to do your research and vet the professionals that you work with, and make sure that they actually know how to do the best practices. So you got to educate yourself a little bit, because I have found myself in positions where I am picking up, cleaning up someone else's mess, basically saying what you experienced before didn't work because it wasn't done correctly. So come in here, I will help you, but we're going to have to clean up some of the mess that was made by the other professional.
Right. I know you're going to be doing this training for people who want to do this. So you know what to look for in a good co-parenting counselor. What should people look for?
Well, I would say at a minimum, there's a great national organization that really is the mothership for the best practices when it comes to the intersection of family law and mental health work, or just in general for court-involved therapists or even attorneys too, who do family law. And it's the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts. It's afccnet.org. And find out if the therapist or even also your attorney is a member. And if they're not, ask them why not. And if they've never heard of it, leave.
Red flag.
Yeah. And like, well, then what are you basing your best practices on?
Right. No, that's great.
You're going to find a lot less subjectivity and more objectivity and more research-based practices when you at least start with, do you even know what national organization comes up with the best practices for what you do for a living?
Right. How often are you finding people that don't?
Way too often. Mm-hmm. Way too often. When I got into this work, just because I am a little bit of a nerd, and
I'm a self-confessed nerd. So
yeah, self-confessed nerd. I read, work-related stuff at the beach. I get way more enjoyment out of that than a romance or something like that. But yeah, so I'm just always like drawn to best practices. That's just part of my professional DNA. So when I first started getting into this, I immediately did research, and I found this organization. I took trainings, and I was broke as a joke, just doing private practice, but I got myself a credit card and I paid to go to one of their national conferences. And, I just talked to everybody, and that's how I did this. And that's not everybody has the luxury, I guess, or maybe the wherewithal to do that, but that's the way I tick. And so, at a minimum, maybe at least find someone that did at least half of that.
Right. Well, we want someone that has that initiative to be helping us in court, yes, or be taking on this role.
That's so important because court is 100% logic. And this is where a lot of the injustice can happen. And this is where a lot of the bad advice can happen, is that if you don't understand that logic doesn't live here in these types of dynamics, and courts don't, you go to law school because you like logic, you love logic. You don't go to law school because you really like the abstract and not being able to figure things out. That's why we become therapists. And so that's why they need this training as well. And they need to understand this. And usually the more experience they have in this field, they see how messy and complicated it can be, and they can recognize that. But in general, court-involved issues when it comes to children can be more precarious because of the assumption of logic.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned injustices. What kind of things have you seen or tried to change with your own business?
I'm so glad you asked that question, Amy. It all started with an almost injustice. That's how I got started. This was not on my horizon. Never in a million years could I have predicted that this would be the path that I would take. But I was just doing child therapy. I was also formerly the director of a child advocacy center. And so that's where I got certified as a forensic interviewer. And so I specialized in treating sexual abuse in children as part of my practice, coming with that background. And so I was known for that. And I get a call from a desperate mom one day, and her 3-year-old has disclosed sexual abuse by her father, the child's father. And, it's very important that when that happens, that you do not see a counselor first, because that can disrupt the potential prosecution down the road. So I told the mom, I'm like, before I see her, you have to do 1, 2, and 3. And that includes contacting law enforcement, doing really hard stuff. This mom did everything I asked her to do, everything to a T. She moved out. She contacted law enforcement. She did everything. DFACS was contacted. DFACS is our Department of Family Children Services. Child Protective Services was involved. And I'm like, okay, you did all the things. The child had a forensic interview, and now I can see her. And for lots of reasons, primarily one being her age, although this was a very verbal child, very smart child. Law enforcement did not press charges based on her forensic interview. They didn't feel like it was enough. And typically with these cases, there's not actual physical evidence. Child Protective Services closed their case because mom moved out. So from their perspective, child is safe now. So next thing mom does is file for divorce. And dad goes after custody. So I find myself as the therapist of the child as her last line of defense. Mm-hmm. And because I knew what I knew already, I had actually referred this mom to an attorney who used to be an assistant district attorney that prosecuted these kinds of cases. So I gave her the right resource. And I'm getting chills as I say this. And
I am too.
This was 10 years ago. Then I realized it came down to me. I'm the last line of defense for this child. And I always remember consulting with other professionals, and everyone just threw their hands in the air and like, I don't know what to tell you. So I recall vividly, I got on the stand. It was a custody hearing between the dad and the mom. And there's so I want to say that the mom's attorney subpoenaed me. And I do that regularly as a child therapist. I'm one of the few child therapists that will go to court because I think it's a way to advocate for the children. And I've got protocol in place to protect my relationship with the children. I haven't had an issue yet in 10 years, but the mom called me to the stand, asked me some questions, and she can't ask any leading questions because she called me first. So then the dad's attorney asked me questions, but on cross-examine, he can ask me whatever, and then she can ask me follow-up, whatever. So I share that because that's important, because sometimes therapists don't or people, expert witnesses and stuff, don't realize that you can be asked separate types of questions, depending on the order in which you get called and all that kind of stuff.
And then once the evidence is verified, and then it has to be admissible in certain requirements, right?
But on cross-exam, or like when she did her follow-up with me, she could ask me, kind of whatever. But it was kind of like a beautiful moment in a way, because I had worked with this attorney before, and she knew what I knew, and I knew what she knew. And so she knew the right kinds of questions to ask me. Side note, I do consultation with attorneys to teach them how to ask therapists the right kind of questions. And I basically traumatized the whole room. The judge was traumatized because I laid it all out. Everything this child had told me in therapy. I had also taken the step to record the sessions with the mom's attorney just in case it needed to be used for prosecution purposes later down the line. And I had credentials that you couldn't look past. My credentials were solid too. So I knew what I was talking about. I had the credentials to back it up. And basically the judge looked at me and said, "What do I do?" Because a lot of times, if there's no substantiated protective services case and there's no charges pressed, then family court judges will they're forced to kind of look at it like nothing happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been there, so I know.
Yeah. But if you got an expert witness who knows what they're doing, knows how to testify, has their credentials, knows their stuff, then that's how you protect children in custody battles without those other more concrete things. And so that's when I realized, if I'm not in this world, there's children going unprotected. And so I saw that gap. I saw that systemic failure. And I said, I can do something about this.
That's beautiful. You've gotten into that. You mentioned a couple of things I wanted to ask questions about. The 3-year-old in the forensic interview. We know kids don't tend to talk at that age in forensic interviews. Can you speak on that, or what you know about that?
Yeah. So the younger the child, there's actually, these days, it's evolved a little bit since then, since she had hers, but there's also something called a forensic evaluation, which is primarily a lot of times done for younger kids. And it's a series of interviews. So it helps them to, like, you kind of build a little bit rapport with them, help them feel comfortable. And you do the interview over the course of multiple meetings. We're trained as forensic interviews to, we have to take our therapist hat off for the most, for part of it, but you can be a little bit more in the gray area when you're doing the evaluations of younger children. And then just how they're interpreted is also just how we have a training on how children disclose, which is something that the average person doesn't understand, is that children have a way of disclosing that's very different than how you would disclose to a friend something you've kept a secret for a long time. You would probably lay it all out. Children don't do that. Children do things like, I'm trying to remember the phrase, but it's kind of like a minimal disclosure. They'll just give you a breadcrumb. Oh, it just happened once. Or, but what we know about, we also have to learn about sexual offenders and child predators. We have to learn how they think as part of our training, how they operate. So you put the two together when you're interpreting it. And law enforcement, who specializes in these two, a lot of times they go through the same training. So there's a lot of nuances to it that can evolve out of the evaluation, the series of evaluations. And it's based a lot of times more on than just what the child was able to say or didn't say.
Mm-hmm. And you also mentioned you recording sessions for the attorney. I get asked a lot, should I record when I talk to my spouse? Should I record in therapy? Should I record? What do you offer as far as that? Because you did it with consent in the legal way.
Well, I did it with consent, and I was not doing it for the attorney. I was doing it for law enforcement because I had spoken with the investigator, and she had agreed to keep her case open and not close it just in case something happened. I don't typically record for attorneys, but I would record if there was a reason to. In this case, it would be to make sure that to increase my credibility. Since I wasn't acting as a forensic interviewer, I was acting as a therapist so that they could see what I did as well as what was documented that I said the child said. So I didn't want to, I just want to dot my I's and cross all my T's in that one. But a lot of times I work with a lot of parents who have that question too. And I think it really comes down to protection. If your motivation is to protect yourself or to protect your children, sometimes that's necessary to record. If you find that your spouse, your ex-spouse, is really just pulling the wool over everyone's eyes, you might want to think about recording. In Georgia, you also want to know your laws about it. In Georgia is a one-party consent state. So you can legally record someone without their permission because you're the party.
Verbally, not audio, correct?
No, it includes audio too.
Oh, okay. I meant audio, not on camera.
Oh, right. Yes. So audio, you can record and it can be legally admissible. Mm-hmm. When it comes to recording children, I will say that courts don't like that in general. And the reason, and it's not really that effective, to be honest, because the court, with their logic mind and their forensic way of looking at things, they're going to focus more on the context that you didn't record. So if your child has a disclosure and you just capture the disclosure, that's going to be more suspicious to the court because they want to know what happened before and what happened after that. So the only time that I've seen it be a little bit effective is that it was a really long recording. So there's lots of context provided. So, you're going to run your batteries down.
Or have a lot of those little tape recorders saved in a box.
Yes. And kids don't like to be recorded. And so if your child is in therapy, I just think it's worthwhile to just check with their provider, their therapist, like, what do you think about this? Could this cause harm to my child? Because I guarantee you the other party is going to point fingers at you and say, look, you're not a good parent because you're doing this. But if you said, well, I consulted with their therapist first, then you've negated that argument to an extent.
Right. So you've mentioned courses and things you offer. I know you have a podcast out. What else do you have for people that are listening that can go and find more information?
Yeah. So like I said, I have my organization, which is the Divorce Resource Center of Georgia. And then I also have my consultation and training program that I do my podcast from, which is Know Divorce Drama. And that's KNOW, Know Divorce Drama, because there's no such thing as NO divorce drama.
Right. And we'll put all this in the show notes so people can link to it.
And, what good thing for your listeners to know is that when it comes to parent coordination and other kind of court-ordered services, you don't have to be in the same state necessarily as that provider because it's not mental health. So your HIPAA protected services like therapy, you do need to be in the same state as your provider. But I do parent coordination with people that live out of state. And I find that virtual is even better because I'm the kind of parent coordinator who will mute you if you're not behaving. So if you think about, having to do a joint session with somebody, I'm not going to let you be abusive. I'm not going to let you go down a rabbit hole. I will give you a warning that you're about to be muted. And if you don't follow it, you'll get muted. And then
it's like in the classrooms, teachers with Zoom, how they would mute children. Yes. So I love that.
I very much am the ornery class teacher when I have to be. But, and so what I want, really what my dream is, my mission, just my pie in the sky vision is I want to strengthen this world. I want to strengthen the system, not just in Georgia, but everywhere, because it's a global issue. But strengthen it with, I want, therapists that work with children, especially to understand this dynamic of the drama triangle and how it can affect children. Because I have to teach this to them too. I want them to understand what they know and what they don't know, and know how to stay in their lane, and know how to be perceived and be credible when they give their opinions, and give their opinions based on best practices and not assumptions. I want legal professionals, judges, and attorneys that work in these settings to understand this too, because it's so complex. I went to, school, and I learned about one thing. The attorneys went to school and learned about one thing. We need to know about each other too. If you're doing family law in whatever capacity, you need to understand family dynamics and family dysfunction, and how to address it, in addition to being able to advocate for your client in law. And there's just so much subjectivity in this field. So just overall, I want to change that. So I have courses both for mental health professionals and legal professionals on my website that they can take. And then my other passion is to help people navigating divorce in the initial stages, do things in a way that, you or I knew how to do it.
And we're talking about that trauma response, and when you first go in. So how would you work with someone, or what advice would you give?
So the trauma response, divorce is trauma. Mm-hmm. And in itself, you add on the layers and the reasons for divorce, then you're dealing with some heavy, complex stuff. Just a side note, when I first started this organization, I was very surprised at the number of women in particular I got coming to me who were leaving domestic violence situations that nobody in their life knew about. It had been under the radar the whole time. No police had ever been called, nothing. Divorce was the solution. So lots of complex trauma going on. That is not the time to call an attorney and be pressured into making lifelong decisions for you and your children. You have got to understand what's happening to you first. You are in a brain fog. Your ability to even conceive things logically is literally impaired. You literally have brain damage if we looked at your scans compared to a time when you did not have a trauma response going on. So I have a course also that is way less expensive than a retainer for an attorney to help guide you through understanding what's going on, knowing what's going to be expected of you, and knowing some different ways to make decisions before you call your attorney. Because one thing that I have that a lot of folks don't have is a collection of stories. I've been doing this long enough. I've seen just about everything. I've got bizarre cases that, I have a category of bizarre things that I've seen. And so usually, people will say like, oh, I'm about to tell you what happened to me. I bet you haven't seen anything like that before. And I'm like, try me. I bet I have. But that's wisdom that I can share with people, So there's so much that I want to help with in those, mainly those three categories, because for me, it's all about the kids. I want the kids, I want the parents to be healthy so the kids can be healthy. So this, transition that happens to a lot of people is less traumatic, basically.
Right. And that's one of those things that I would have been so eager to sign up for. I walked into that 30-day hearing with chapstick and a little Bible verse printed in my pocket, thinking, okay, all I have to do is tell the truth, like Mark Twain said, and I'm cool. And then I look around and my ex walks in with a rolling cart with 3 boxes stacked high of documents. And I just get question after question. What document is this? What's this? I just looked off into space and don't even know what I said. Mm-hmm. So I think getting that trauma down is so important.
Yes.
And then being confident too.
And know what the tricks are that are coming at you. That box that you saw, that was a trick. That was noise. All of that was intended. I guarantee you that was intended to create the trauma response in you that happened. Mm-hmm. It was never about facts. It's about, I know how to make her feel. Let's do it while she's on the stand. Mm-hmm. That was abuse in and of itself.
Right. I laughed and went to my parents for safety reasons, so he could be served. And in the hearing, his story was so good, I believed it at first, that I had to question, be like, wait a minute, no, that's not what happened. But he started crying and saying that in the middle of the day, for some reason, I thought my home had been invaded and I had to cut off all the credit cards and move all our money. And the tears were pouring down his face. And I looked over and was like, oh no, I believe him. But it's just being prepared for any story, because one thing we know with like that people in the drama triangles you mentioned, it doesn't make sense. There's no logic. So anything can come out.
Right, right. The crazier you feel is just a sign that you're in the drama triangle. It's not a sign that you're crazy.
I love that. So what's one final, I guess, piece of advice or words of wisdom you would want to leave people with?
Really, that your experience in the past, sometimes a common thing I hear is people beating themselves up for not doing things differently after they hear this information that I give them, because it sounds so simple. It is not simple. When you are living in it, you cannot see the forest for the trees. Like you are in it. It is in your face. You're living it. You're in survival mode. You don't have the ability to see things with hindsight yet. That's what you're experiencing when you hear this, is hindsight. It is not, I want people to not beat themselves up for not realizing this sooner, because this is something that is very specific and very much unknown in the general population. So just that's the main thing, is that hear this and move forward with confidence, rather than hearing this and spending too much time wishing you had known this in the past, or beating yourself up for not knowing it. We're going to pay it forward.
Right. I love it, because it's just one more tool in the toolbox for people to take with them and move forward.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to link everything you mentioned in the notes so people can find you, and just appreciate you being on here and sharing your wisdom.
Thank you so much for having me, Amy.
Thank you again for tuning in to our podcast, Hope After Narcissistic Abuse. We hope you were able to leave with some renewed hope. And if you like what you heard, please subscribe to the channel, give us a review, head to the show notes for more information on the things that we highlighted. And there's also a link to the website for a course that we offer on the same topic, Hope After Narcissistic Abuse. Thank you again, and please tune in to the next episode.